Let's move on to other markets now, commodities markets. Now we're talking about renewable energy, and according to a report by the International Renewable Energy Agency, nearly 60% of Nigeria's energy demand in 2050 can be met with renewable energy sources, saving 40% in natural gas and 65% in oil needs at the same time. Let's talk to Chinan Dikwa, now Vice Chair, African Energy Council. Join us via Zoom. Great to have you.
Hi, Ladi. Great pleasure to be here.
So how feasible is it to have up to 60% of Nigeria's energy needs met by renewables by 2050?
Fantastic question. I was going to say just very quickly, this is a report that's been commissioned by the International Renewable Energy Association in conjunction with the Nigerian Renewable Energy Commission. So it's a joint report. Now, how feasible, to your question, I really think massively feasible, and it's a very exciting prospect for the Nigerian state. The reason for that is, if you look today, 55% of the population have some sort of electricity and power in today's Nigeria. But really, 45% are completely in the blackout. So a proposition like this, where you have renewable energy, which is distributed generation, you produce it literally on the roof of your house, produce power at source, consume at source, you are the transmitter, distributor of that electricity. It's a very exciting prospect for the Nigerian state and for the Nigerian people. You cut out anything to do with the grid. And now thinking about that, actually, in today's Nigeria, when you look at the grid system that we have, just the pure losses on the grid is about 40%. So if you put 100 electrons on that grid system, you lose 40% of it. Only 60% get to source. Now, in a renewable energy setting like we have today, you'd produce a source, 100 electrons, and literally almost get 100. Not quite 100, but you'd almost get 100 at source. So it's a very exciting prospect. And how feasible it is very feasible. Because when we look today, we see that the cost of renewable energy, solar panels are dropping massively. I think over the last 10 years, it's dropped about 80%, if you like. So very possible to answer your question.
Right, and talking about renewable energy prices now, you know, critics still say that the prices are still high regardless. How do you think this is going to affect demand, you know, coming from these parts?
A really good question, Ladi. It is very true that when you look at renewable energy, the cost of electricity for renewable energy technologies today, okay, or actually if you go back 5 years ago and looked at that cost and compared it with conventional technologies like hydropower or CCGT, so combined cycle gas turbines, if you compared the two 5-10 years ago, renewables were still 3 times or 2 times more expensive. However, in today's world, in the world we live today, the cost of renewable energy has plummeted so much that it's almost comparable. So when you look at the cost of electricity, and that's the way you have to compare these technologies, when you look at the cost of electricity between these two, there is almost price parity. So it makes a lot of sense that if you are part of that 45% in Nigeria who do not have electricity, you know, solar is a great thing to consider. Now, and I appreciate the initial capital investment, the money you need to put down initially for you to get that whole system set up is quite substantial. But then, Ladi, you know this, this is where the banks come in. This is where banks come in to try to finance such arrangements and make it possible for people to have electricity and then pay off over a period of time.
And definitely with the rate hikes globally, that's obviously going to dent, you know, what the banks can do at this time. But what kind of policy and infrastructure financing requirements are needed to actually make this a reality?
It's a very interesting one. I think when we think about this as a state, as a Nigerian state, I think the first thing to think about before we look at policy is to understand that the future is changing rapidly. And because the future is changing rapidly, we need to start to look at investments in renewables and not lock ourselves into large capital gas or oil projects. Now, those are great, of course, because when we talk about renewables, they're mainly addressing the residential market. So perhaps my house or your house, Ladi, where you have renewable up in front of your house. But if you think about Unilever cannot function their manufacturing plants based on renewable energy. So there's still a place for gas. But to answer your question, what kind of policy frameworks? The Nigerian state needs to think very especially about what's the investment we're going to make in the next 4 or 5 years. You know, is it gas? Is it some into renewable energy? How do we lobby the National Assembly to make sure that they pass some laws that are favorable to us? How do we put the enabling framework, like we're talking about there, for the banks to make sure that they put in loans that back individuals who can take some of these things and pay over time? But you're 100% right. I was listening to your other segment. The rise in interest rates, you know, could really challenge some of these things. But hopefully, in a world where we're hoping the forecast is, you know, a couple of years down the line, where we start seeing this interest rates come down, then I think there could be a big opportunity here.
Right, and we have a new president now, president-elect, so I'm sure he's going to have to put all of that into consideration to take us to where we want to be with renewable energy. Well, thank you so much, Chinan Dikwo, Vice Chair, African Energy Council. It was great having your perspective. Thank you.
Pleasure.